Hi, and welcome to this training webinar on management systems implementation. So what we want to say right at the very beginning of this session is just a short foreword. An organization can have the best processes, procedures, and supporting documentation, as well as equipment in the world, but without the correctly trained, competent, and motivated people, the system will not be effective. So you must consider the human, the people within our organization, as part of the system. For it to be successful, then you need to have everyone within the organization driving in the same way. And it's really important that we say this at the beginning, as we have witnessed so many times where systems are built in silo, fantastic systems by fantastic individuals, but not properly implemented throughout an organization. So we must remember the human as part of our systems. So let's talk briefly about what are the benefits of a management system and implementation benefits. So it improves the management of hazards and risks across the business. It allows us to set targets to try and drive reductions in our hazards, wastes, and errors. It allows us to initiate and maintain procedures to improve our efficiencies, not just effectiveness, but efficiencies. And we like to say that this should be done using a quality process approach to drive continual improvement, to have effective purchasing procedures and processes, to work with contractors to ensure your expectations are driven down through your supply chain, and using more innovative equipment to reduce the impact in our organization. One of the key benefits is to define key responsibilities for achieving our targets and goals, and to promote a culture of awareness among our staff and our contractors to encourage good adoption of the management system, but also to gain their knowledge on improvement ideas. A key benefit is monitor and measure the performance against key indicators and objectives, regardless of what those indicators may be. Just going to take a short break here. And I'm back again. Benefits provide regular access, progress towards achieving set objectives, and ensure due diligence and ongoing consideration of legal and other requirements. It also provides assistance with health and safety and environmental reporting as may be required by law, and what may be driven by government policy, and communicates good practice to industry and communities around us as well, where appropriate, in terms of environmental impact. It can help us contribute to preferred employer status, achieve cost savings, show leadership, both nationally or internationally if we're an international organisation, and obtain competitive advantage. It's important to recognise that a management system may be required by our clients or our customers or even by regulatory bodies. So having this management system, it's important that we get the benefits from it, that we build up goodwill with our customers, employees and stakeholders, including possibly the public, depending upon where we work. So to get the real benefits of a management system, it must be implemented into the business effectively. Another significant benefit of a well-implemented management system is the ability to drive continual improvement. And continual improvement can only really be achieved if everyone in the organization is on the same journey, so that we are setting a strategy and the processes to support that, measuring our performance and having a commitment to drive improvement on that. It's also important to remember that to continually improve our systems, it can be a benefit to demonstrate an integration of various aspects of systems together, working in the same drive to improve. So, for example, improvement in a quality approach may have a knock-on effect to improve also our environmental, health and safety, information security systems as well. As part of implementing a management system, it's important also to recognize the different interactions of the elements of a management system. And often these come from the requirements, first of all, set by the standards that we want to achieve. But it's important that people within an organization understand why they are there. So when we look at this, we talk about from our legal requirements and how we set our significant risks and environmental aspects and business risks. We want to align that with our legal and other requirements depending on the industries we work in. And from this, we want to set our top level policies within the business and our objectives and targets of what we want to try and achieve. Remember, your management system should be driven by the knowledge that you want to continually improve what you're doing and have the support of the full organization to achieve that. So we may have different programs and plans in terms of project development, change management. We also will have our operational control elements. This is around how we manufacture our products, how we service our clients, and so on and so forth. Very specific to the business that we operate in. And then also depending upon the business we operate in and the industry to which that is within, our emergency preparedness and response will also be very significant in what we try to achieve from our policies, legal requirements, and our objectives and targets. And all of these activities must feed into monitoring and measurement. It's important that we understand how well we are doing. So if we monitor and measure our activities and importantly analyze our performance, then we can drive corrective and preventative actions out of this, as well as reporting suggested improvements in performance in our management review. And remember that our compliance obligations and internal audits looks across all of the system to see where we can be more efficient and more effective. And we must remember that there are a whole heap of supporting activities and processes that come with that, starting off with how we communicate and make people aware of our management system, how we ensure that people have the competence, training and awareness, how we allocate the necessary resources, have our document control, and of course, any supporting legal requirements around calibration, certifications, and so on. So let's first of all talk about engagement and communication. One of the fundamental mistakes that many organizations make is that their engagement and communication comes quite late on in the process of implementation. This is a failure. It's important at the earliest stage in development of your internal processes that you engage with the workforce around what it is that you are trying to achieve, and of course to give consideration of the impact on the key individuals within your organization. You have to decide how to keep the engagement process open and positive, thus ensuring that you learn from your workforce and external parties you interact with so that you can adjust your implementation process to align with the requirements of your business and the workforce. Using a communication strategy and process may be a good approach to do this, and it should ensure open, consistent and positive leadership direction if it's taken from the top down. Engagement with external parties is undertaken should this be deemed necessary at this early stage of implementation, and you would deem that to be necessary depending upon understanding how much you require external parties as part of your normal day-to-day business operations. So if you're heavily utilizing contractors in your normal day-to-day operations, then you may wish to engage with them at a very, very early stage so that they get involved, they provide some wisdom, and also any impact that could happen with them. We must also think about planning. So implementation planning. The impact on an organization can often be far deeper than anticipated at these early stages. Often organizations, particularly larger organizations, and particularly ones that have grown at a very rapid pace, the people are used to working in a way that they have not been curtailed as much in the methods that a management system will be driving that. So often, if we don't have an implementation plan and we don't measure the impact and work closely with our workforce, we can breed fear, and this can be the fear of the unknown. And when we have a fear of unknown, often as humans, we build up resistance. We defend and try not to fall into that because we have a fear of that change. So it's important that we share the information, the experiences and concerns in a good way to ensure that our plans are well placed for success. And of course, we want to keep that regular open dialogue and try to remove the fears. Let's address the fears. Let's be open about them and speak about them and why they're there and how we can try and impact on them. Often something new can bring about lots of questions. So utilize resources at your disposal to understand the unknown. There are lots of free resources out there on the internet, lots of YouTube videos where you can provide guidance to your workforce. And the utilization of resources may be sending out newsletters, putting stuff up on notice boards, maybe if you have TVs throughout your office, inside your welfare or canteen facilities, it's good to be able to show some of these messages. And of course, it's good as well to put the human element to it. So having people within your organization talk about what it is you're trying to achieve. People need to understand why you're doing what you're doing. What is it you're going to undertake, when, and by whom? So it's important that people understand their impact and what the impact is on them and their day-to-day life, and what the end goal is and what you're trying to achieve. But it's always important to make your plans, your implementation plans, dynamic, but ensure all stakeholders are engaged and in agreement. So some key steps that we must form to establish our management system. We've got to obtain commitment from top management. This has got to be driven from top down, so we must get that commitment. We must then define key responsibilities within the organization, appoint possibly a management team or a delegate who would be a representative. It may be, depending on the size of the organization, that you want to have a management system steering committee that will help develop the implementation plan, the initial training on the management system, and the way in which you will communicate it and make people aware. Also, we need to think about, from a planning point of view, how we are going to identify our business hazards and risks, and what our legal and other requirements are, how we are going to formulate our policies, set our objectives, targets, and what KPI programs we may wish to achieve. And remember, this is at the planning stage. So we're looking at how we are going to achieve this, not necessarily identifying exactly what it is. And then we have to think about the implementation and the operation. So what impact will it will have on our day-to-day operations? So how are we going to do this implementation process? We have to develop key documentation and processes, and therefore involvement of individuals throughout the workforce is really important in that process. We have to be able to check how well we implement our systems. So we have to think ahead. What are we going to be doing to monitor and measure how well we are achieving this? And of course, how to put the necessary corrective and preventative actions in place to address anything we see in the early phases that may need adjusted and changed. And lastly, we talk about a presentation and how we go about driving that awareness throughout our business. So these are the things we have to think about establishing our management system. When we get into actually implementing it, then we have to have clear direction of what it is and clear messages of awareness and ability to get feedback. Once we start to implement our system, we must have an established internal audit program. Internal auditing is one of the key fundamental areas to allow us to monitor and measure our system's performance, but also to help us drive improvements throughout the business. We must ensure that people have the necessary training to undertake the auditing, and we must understand what they're going to be auditing against. So in terms of implementing a system, initially we may be focused on looking at the comparison to various international standards, as well as aligning that to our business practices and risks. We must follow up our internal audits with improvements to the system. So internal audits cannot be about just simply ticking a box. They must be about finding areas to improve and identifying gaps within our system. Management reviews is also a key fundamental area of establishing your management system. It brings about a formalized process of assessing and bringing to a formal meeting, let's say, to give an understanding of the status of the system, what has gone on in the period since the last management review, and what actions need to come out of it to continually drive improvement or correct problems. And we must implement them. It's important that we don't just create actions which are lying on a meeting minute and nothing gets done about it. We must implement those improvements from the management review, and we must think about how we are going to do that. How are we going to drive those improvements? Are we going to use electronic systems that track our actions? Are we going to simply just email them, put them on a register? We need to decide how we're going to do that. And of course, ongoing throughout this, we're going to be busy establishing the system, busy implementing it, busy improving it, but we must continue with our communication and our employee engagement. The early steps of a management system can be very focused on the documentation needed, but it's important that in order for that documentation and that system to be effective, that we must continually communicate and engage with our workforce, because we want our implementation of the system to be effective. And remember, implementation is not simply about sending out one newsletter or sending an email to everyone and telling them, we now have this management system and you can find it here. Implementation is a process itself, and it must be monitored and understood how effective it is. So we must give that capability to measure it and to get feedback for employees of how well it's working for them and where changes can happen. So ongoing analysis, ongoing engagement, and ongoing improvement is a key fundamental step to establish the management system. We're going to talk about 4 phases now in the implementation process in a little bit more detail. First phase we're going to talk about is gap analysis and implementation action plans, identifying key responsibilities. So what do we mean when we talk about a gap analysis? Well, a gap analysis, in effect, is a form of audit. You don't necessarily have to have any formal training to do it, but it's good practice to have someone that has the competence and the experience that understands what the expectations and needs are of a particular ISO standard or multitude of ISO standards, for example. They need to understand your business as well as what the requirements are, and they need to start to develop in terms of what type of checklists or gap analysis program they're going to follow. Out of this should effectively be a report which documents and identifies the gaps of where you are today, and importantly, the advice and direction needed in order to close those gaps. And remember, when we're closing the gaps, it's not all about the standards and the ISO requirements. It's got to intertwine and be part and understand the various parts within our business. A good recommendation here is that out of a gap analysis is to have a project tracker. It allows us to keep control of the actions required as part of our implementation. And it gives us a good tool to go to in managing what is effectively a project. So this identifies the gaps from the gap analysis, identifies who the individuals are that have been given these actions to achieve, and importantly, provides some timeline around that. And it gives you a tool to work with when you are maybe having a update meeting to identify the status of where you're at. So it can be quite a straightforward area, document. It could be an ability to simply take one standard and show the different aspects associated to the clauses. But it is important to always recommend that you intertwine this with the business activities that you have. So it should be an element by element guidance. It should be written to identify the gaps between the current activities and those necessary to meet the requirements of the standard, but they should be specific to your organizational requirements, okay? These should not be about taking a gap analysis done for some other business and using that. Yes, a template that may have been used before is absolutely fine, but we must remember that it's got to be specific to our organizational requirements. And the gaps that are documented in our action plan effectively form our project tracker. So when we look at a project action plan, it should be simple, flexible, quite often good to use a traffic light system. Red mean we are nowhere near where we need to be. Amber, we're working on it. Green, we're good to go. It should identify responsibilities and accountabilities. So ideally, it should state the people or the team that's involved in doing it. And these individuals must be aware of this. They must be happy to be identified as being responsible and accountable for these actions. And it's used as a good tool for your regular project progression meetings. Effectively, what this does is it's an ability to give you the pictorial view to see how close you are to having green across your implementation plan, action plan, so that you're good to go. And this is an example of some of the things that you might have in place. So here is a an action plan with 30 items on it, specifically associated to a particular management system implementation. And it's identified what some of the key elements are. The status using the traffic light system. We've got the action E and we've got some comments. The only thing missing from this which I would say would be important to add, is a time bound, because we don't want things lagging behind and find that everything else is being worked on, everything else is ready, and then we have something that's lagged behind that stops us or prevents us from moving forward. It's important to understand the role of management. So even in this early stage, when we're doing our gap analysis and our implementation planning, the management must provide the necessary resources for us to do it. They must provide us a budget to train these resources as required, or appoint external support if we need to. So now let's step into phase 2. So we've now created our gap analysis. We've now have our project action plan in place, and we have our key project tracker to allow us to go through and undertake what we need to in terms of preparing the system. So let's talk a little bit, first of all, about policies. So there can sometimes be confusion around what a policy is. So policy really should be about setting the direction for the way the organization plans to manage its quality, health, safety, environment, or any other type of system. And importantly, the impacts and the risks that they see at a high level. It should be set by top management with inputs as required from appropriate people within the organization. And it really acts as the pinnacle of the management system. Of course, there can be other policies underneath our management system policies that may be more specific to messages of exactly what it is that people must do. But in terms of the management system policies, these are quite high level, and they should include commitments to the management of risk or legal compliance or communication methods, and importantly, a drive to continually improve our systems. They can often include a framework for setting objectives and targets, and often I see it that organizations may put some of those very high level objectives and targets in place. But it's important to recognize that these high level objectives and targets should be drilled down through the business to create departmental or operational or individual objectives and targets. These high-level policies must be effectively communicated throughout the organization to employees, and of course, where required, to contractors that engage with our business. When we talk about objectives and targets, so objective is really about an overall goal consistent with the policies that the organization wants to achieve. So what are these high-level things that we want to do? And the target could be more detailed performance requirements and how we're going to achieve the objective. And we should consider how our supply chain and contractors fit within these. If we are heavily involved and our supply chain and contractors are very significant to our business, then we must remember that they may be the ones that could have a potential impact on what our targets and objectives are. So they may need to be heavily involved in setting these and what they are going to do to try and achieve and help us achieve them. So when we think about our policy statement, indicates what it is important for the organization in general terms. So objectives must show more specific goals to be achieved within a certain time frame and must be measurable. So we may have high level things within our policies that we spoke about, but we need to be able to see how they will fall out throughout the business and how we can take those and basically deliver against them. So examples of that might be that we want to try and reduce our scrap level, for example, by 10 months within a certain time period. And we need to know what are the drivers of scrap currently so that we know who those targets and objectives are applied to. We might want to increase our recycling by 50% in the next year. Looks like a big target to try and achieve. But what we want to do is we want to understand how we're going to do that. So are we going to do that internally, or are we going to use a subcontractor or supplier to help us? What about reducing customer complaints? Well, actually, to reduce your customer complaints, if you have a significant number of them, you need to really analyze and understand what those complaints are in the first place. You need to know what the root cause is associated to them in order for you to try and drive improvement, like, for example, to reduce it by 25% year on year. So in order for you to do that, it's okay having a high level target just simply to reduce customer complaints, but to have this target of 25% year on year, you really need to understand and analyze what your existing customer complaints have been in order for you to focus your attention on areas that you can drive the improvement. So there are a multitude of different types of objectives and targets and goals that we can achieve. And it's important that we recognize that these are put in place for the benefit of our business, not for the benefit of an external ISO certification auditor, not for the benefits of any international standard. They have to be for the benefit of our business. It's important at these early stages of implementing a management system, start small and build on a firm foundation. You should have at least one macro level objective regarding supplier performance, overall system effectiveness, and possibly customer satisfaction. And it's important to remember that these should be monitored and measured for their performance. Now let's think a little bit about hazards and aspects within our business. What we need to understand within our organization when implementing a management system is that we have to already understand what the environmental aspects and the business and health and safety hazards are within our organization. And of course, we need to understand what the impact these environmental aspects and the risks associated to our business and health and safety hazards. And when I say business risks, I can be referring to anything associated to business continuity, information security, financial risk, quality risk, whatever it is that's specific to your business. So determine what is significant to your business and what brings about the potential greatest harm. So something goes wrong as a result of an environmental aspect or a health and safety hazard or business hazard, something goes wrong. What brings about the greatest risk to your business and harm to your business? And you want to look to document and maintain that. You have to start somewhere. So typically this is developed as part of the risk register, for example, or aspects and impacts register, or information security risk register. And it should focus on the risk control measures. So it's not just about saying these are our potential risks and we believe we have these control measures that do this. They've got to be quite clear, got to be able to demonstrate them. So if you were to audit your risk register, that you would be able to look at the control measures and say, okay, based on the control measures documented here that says that we minimize the risk or harm to our business from these particular elements, I should be able to audit these and see these control measures or have these control measures demonstrated to me so that I can see that we have control over these. So here's an example of what we might look at in terms of identifying what are potential high-level hazards. It may be we understand what the activity is, what the environmental aspect is, what the area that could be impacted in the environment, and what those impacts are. Now, at this stage, we've not started talking about how we control them and what we're going to do. First of all, we've just looked at What are the significant environmental aspects associated to the activities that we do? So this is a way of us teasing out and identifying what these areas are. And remember, we must consider sort of the life cycle approach when it comes to our risks within our business. So first of all, we must think about the activities we do in our normal day-to-day operations. So if, for example, we are a manufacturing facility, it might be our normal operations within our manufacturing facility, from parts coming in to going to our production line, to being produced, to being tested, to being packed, stored, shipped, transported. Day-to-day normal activities. So we must consider what those are. We must also consider abnormal activities. And abnormal activities may be that when we, let's say, shut down our operation once every 2 years for 1 month or 1 week or 1 day, and we undertake a significant maintenance program, or that may be that we do that once every 3 months. These are a little bit more abnormal activities. So we must understand, is there additional risks that occur at this time? Are we bringing in more people into our business, contractors, for example, where they are maybe helping us to do the maintenance activity or upgrade? And another abnormal might be that we might be putting an extension onto our facility, or changing the layout of our facility, or installing a new production line. Or it could be that we are suddenly taking on different types of service activity. So we may have bought another business and absorbed that into ours, and suddenly we are doing different types of services out in the field to our clients. So these may not fall under our normal activities. They may become, in some cases, normal, but at the moment they may be a little bit abnormal, and we need to understand the risks associated to that. And lastly, we must also think about emergency situations. We all hope, of course, that we don't have that situation, but we must consider it. And we must consider emergency not just in the conception of a fire or an explosion or something like that. We must think about emergencies associated to the environment. And we must also think about emergencies associated to our business activities, where we may think about we have to shut down our operations. Is there anything we can do in this emergency situation to try and maintain business as normal, some form of business continuity? What about in terms of we have had an emergency situation because of a data breach? We've had an attack on our information security systems, and we have to take emergency protocols. What do we have in place to manage that in terms of our risks associated to that? And have we considered them? Because they are different than normal situations. Yes, in normal situations, we have, for example, associated to fire, our escape plan, our emergency response plan, our extinguishers, our alarm system, our muster point, etc., etc. And we've made everyone aware. But what about when we are in the emergency situation? Do we bring about additional risks, and have we considered them? That's one of the reasons why we do tests and drills on things, to see if there's anything comes out as a result of that. So consider the impact and use. So we must think about our business operations when we are in the process of normal, abnormal, and emergency, and maintenance activities in our normal day-to-day. But we must also think about a disposal point of view as well, and of course a manufacture at the early point in our business. So let's give an example here. If I was a business that I stored fuel, for example, and that was my business, I may need to purchase new tanks to store my fuel. So I want to think about the manufacturing process and the company that's going to manufacture and supply and install these tanks for me, and what risks there could be in terms of the use of that product. Then I might want to pass through and understand our in-service risks, but what about the end of life? What about the disposal of that particular item at the end of its life? And a risk matrix should help us understand that and recognize what needs to be done. It may be that we have to speak to the supplier of this product to consider whether they can put in better methods of manufacturing so that it can be recycled. Maybe they can take it back, reuse it, thinking of different ways. So when we think about risk within our business, we have to understand what the severity of that risk is, and of course, the frequency, the likelihood that it will happen. There are lots of other YouTube videos that we've done talking about risk and how to go into it in a lot more detail. So if you want to have a look on our YouTube channel, you will see lots of other short videos and more in detailed training sessions, very much focused on risk. So the next stage we want to look at is our legal requirements. And of course, we might do that as part of our risk assessment because we have to understand what our legal requirements are that are applicable to our operations of our organization. We must show how our legal requirements apply to our business activities. And of course, we must keep these up to date and incorporate them into the elements of our management system. And we must think about how we are going to do that. Are we going to sign up to online information where information is pushed to us when legal changes occur? Do we have someone in our organization that's competent in that? And part of that sort of area of their responsibilities is to keep an eye on things like this, or how we're going to do it. So we must understand how we do it and how we implement them. And we must understand what legal requirements apply to us. And this, of course, depends upon our business activities, where we operate, and the type of activities that we undertake. We must think also about other requirements, and these may be requirements that are imposed on us by a wider group that maybe our business works for. Possibly we're a division within an international group. We have to think about the industry that we operate in, and are there specific industry codes of practice that we must follow? And what about local government direction? You know, we have devolved government requirements inside the UK. That might be the same in other parts of the world. So what are the specific government direction that we have to follow? And of course, we have to think about local authority as well in terms of local operating governance. And lastly, we think about our client, our commercial client and contract requirements. So these may be specific for a particular job or a particular project, but they bring about additional requirements that we may need to be well aware of and to monitor and measure. So we have to show how these other requirements apply to our management system, keep them updated, and importantly, demonstrate that we can incorporate them into the elements of our system. Now let's think about our management system program and action plan. So how are we going to achieve these objectives and targets and the responsibilities and means of achieving them throughout our program? So we have to have our roles and responsibilities. So management has to provide appropriate resources, as mentioned before. We have to document what those roles and responsibilities and authorities are, whether that be in job descriptions or specifically within our management system documentation. We may want to delegate some responsibilities to a management representative. So we may have a team or an individual that may, certainly in the initial phase, take responsibility for the coordination and the establishment and implementation and maintenance of our management system. Or we may operate in such a way that that's a team that we have going forward. It may be also that they take responsibility to report on the performance of our management system and engage with the workforce to get recommended improvements. And Also, they may be advocates of PDCA, Plan, Do, Check, Act, where we are driving improvement through lessons learned in other areas. So it's important we think about roles and responsibilities, that we consider everyone throughout the organisation and how they play their part in the management system. As well as this, remember, we have to have a level of competence and training within our business so that we understand the needs and expectations associated to our management system and our business activities. So do we have a competence management system in place or a training management system in place? Have we considered what the requirements are to feed into that, specifically associated to our new ISO type management system that we're developing? What we're going to be doing as part of our implementation to provide training and raise competence of our individuals associated to our management system. So we need to identify the positions and the roles. We need to assess the competence to meet those requirements. So we need to potentially do a training needs analysis to see what needs to be done. And remember, when we talk about training, it doesn't necessarily have to be formal, certifiable training that's done by an external provider. This can be a form of training that just simply raises awareness in our people. And that can come from various places like YouTube videos, like people doing some coaching on the job or mentoring. It can come from self-studying and documentation. It's just important that we recognize what the needs are that we require for our organization. And of course, we need to have the desire within our business. We've got to have a desire from our workforce to gain this knowledge so that we can effectively drive our implementation plan forward. Big significant part of any successful implementation of any type of project is ensuring that you raise awareness. So we need to ensure that all appropriate members of staff, and where required, our contractors and supply chain, are aware of our management system and the requirements within it. And importantly, what happens if they do not follow the system, what the implications are. You know, we use a term quite often within FQM. We say people only know what they know until you tell them what you want them to know. So unless people understand about the management system in greater detail, what their impact is on it, and what the impact may be of them not complying with it, they may not have a full grasp and understanding of what significant issues could occur. So we need to propagate that awareness of the management system, and we need to do that through engagement, not just you must do this, you must do that. We want to engage with them. So we want to develop a roadmap to drive that awareness and engage with the workforce to get their feedback. And we must also ensure that communication from external parties is appropriately managed. So how are we going to manage this external communication? So we have to remember that external communication can come in various forms. It could be associated to our legal requirements. It could be associated to industry requirements. It could be associated to contractual and customer-specific communication. We need to understand how we're going to handle that, who's going to be the key points to be responsible. And of course, we must remember that when we get communication like this, we must assess it to see the impact on our business. We don't necessarily just always have to deliver exactly what that communication says. If we think about going back a few years to the regulation change in Europe, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulations, many people within industry simply thought that this was going to have such a massive impact on their business that they started putting big changes in place and big communication programs in place. But instead, what they should have done is they should have looked at the requirements and looked at the impact associated to their business. And yes, changes would have been required, but they should have looked to see the impact first before they decided what changes were put in place. So as the system starts to get implemented, this can often be a time when barriers start to appear. So we might get early engagement and then things start to cause problems. So we need to ensure that the engagement process remains in place and is positive. This will allow these barriers to be reduced if we continue to drive that. People don't like change, and people put barriers up to change. It's just part of our human nature. But if we recognize that at an early stage and not wait for those barriers, but recognize there will be barriers, then if we keep that engagement process going and keep the positive messages happening and the opportunity for these people with these barriers to raise them with us, then we can have a much better chance and opportunity to reduce and minimize those barriers and have a much more successful implementation. We must ensure that there is engagement with external parties, and this is appropriately managed and undertaken. Decide how to keep the engagement process open and positive, ensuring that we learn from our workforce and our external parties that we interact with. So engagement is a fundamental part that must continue throughout the successful implementation and the successful management of a system once it's in place. And then let's think about our documentation. You know, everyone thinks that a management system is only about the documentation. Yes, of course, it's a significant part, but if you only have the documentation and don't have your engagement, your roles and responsibilities, it's just effectively a bunch of documentation. It's not a system. So let's think about our statements of intent. So this may be driven by a group or government body or a high level requirement. This could be our golden rules or statement of what we want to try and achieve. Our policies, again, a high level. And then from that, there could be strategy in how we want to achieve and what we want to achieve, and the plan and how we're going to do it. Setting our objectives and targets, whether that be high level or more granular. Descriptions of the scope of our system. Descriptions of the main elements of our management system and how they interact and reference other documents. And it's, of course, important that we must recognize how they interact with our existing way of working, our existing systems. We don't pick up everything that we do currently and the procedures and work instructions we have and throw them in the bin. We recognize that they work, they may have to be tweaked, but we show how they relate to our management system. Our documents and records are a requirement of the standard. So we must ensure we understand how we are going to manage them, okay, and control them in an appropriate way. So document control. You know, some organizations are very successful at this, others, even large ones, are very poor at it. So I've found myself in large organizations, successful organizations, where we find that they just do not have a good document control system, and there are a multitude of what looks like similar versions of procedures and processes which have been developed by different people and telling you a different message. So let's think about, first of all, we want to have a template of how we are going to control our documents, what document templates we're going to use. And of course, ideally have a numbering convention or a method of uniquely identifying them. We should have a method of what we have to do to approve our documents, how we review them, update them, and if required, go for reapproval. How we identify changes from current revision status, and how we manage those changes, and who ultimately takes the responsibilities. We have to also identify the distribution of external documents within our business where they may be appropriate, and the management of documents which are obsolete and not required. So it's good practice to have a procedure or process that demonstrates to our business how we do this. And of course, there are numerous electronic tools available to us now that assist in this to make the change of documents much more systematically controlled, the distribution of documents much more systematic, and the ability to ensure that obsolete documents are removed from view. So document control is quite significant. Operational control is the physical control of all the activities and functions and products and processes which are associated to what we do day by day, and what significant impacts and risks are aligned to that. So our operational controls must include our documented processes, our work instructions, our operating procedures, our manuals for our machines, and they must define the manner in which control is maintained. And it should be on a risk management basis. And we have to think about the control of our work practices. These may form the basis of how these risks are controlled and managed. So the human element can be very significant in this, and it must be drawn out. And of course, operational control extends to our significant risks from the goods and services that we buy in to our business. So communication with our suppliers and contractors, particularly ones that are a significant part of our operational control, is clearly fundamental as part of the implementation of our management system. So we have to think about our in-service operations. Okay, so during normal, abnormal activities, when there is a significant issue that could occur, and what the potential impact of those may be, that links very heavily into our risks. Then let's think about also our supply chain management. So are we bringing in additional, for this example, environmental risks or environmental impacts to our business? So we need to understand our supply chain management, and we talk about this as like an acquisition life cycle model. So what different gates we have in place to assess when we're purchasing something, what the implications could be from an environmental impact point of view on how we identify the concept of what we want, the assessment, how we demonstrate it, and the manufacturing processes, and then how we will use it and dispose of it. Okay. And think about life cycle. We must think about the life cycle of our products as part of our systems. If we're a small business, then this may be very insignificant and may not have an impact. But if we're a large organization, significantly large, that we may have a significant impact on the environment in the duty of the life cycle, then we have to consider how we will manage the end of life of products and materials that we use, and maybe also that we sell. So we must think about the process of how we are procuring these products, so that what manufacturing practices are being considered. Are we considering local manufactured items, maybe to minimize transport from Asia, for example? Think about, is it more efficient in terms of energy and raw materials as part of its use? Does it minimize waste and emissions as part of its use? And then when we get to the end of life, when we think about disposing it, was it manufactured in such a way that the majority of the items within it, when we dispose of it, can be recycled and can minimize our waste and emissions? So it's important we think all across the life cycle of this. So a life cycle assessment is a formal process as part of your management system, and it should assess the aspects and impacts of your products and services. And it's used related to purchasing of products and services that are embedded as part of your operations or the life of your facility. So, as I said before, it could be pollution arising from a production process. It could be reduced by changes to the raw materials or changes to the equipment or changes to the company that you've used to provide them. And of course, when we look at cradle to grave, we have to think about the disposal or the decommissioning of these particular buildings, items, equipment, products, whatever they may be. How do we go about doing that? Can we have a process in place that can manage that? Is the person that provided us with the item able to undertake that for us? Now let's think about contract management. So a significant risk to particularly large organizations is the use of contractors. So contractors for many large organizations, contractors can form a significant part of their day-to-day operations. This is evident in the energy industry, in the oil and gas industry, in the construction industry, where main contractors may subcontract many elements of activities to other businesses. Similarly, within the oil and gas industry, we may find that operators may subcontract significant elements of their daily operations to other contracting companies. So we should develop, where that is appropriate to our business, we should develop a contract management process. And supporting processes and procedures and documents is of importance if there is significant risk that could come from or need to be managed by our contractors. We need to develop an assessment of how our supply chain operates so that we identify that everyone that requires to use our supply chain processes may have to set a minimum set criteria. And we must work closely to ensure that our contractors and supply chain understand our organizational management system requirements and how we have implemented them, how we may have to implement certain elements to our contractors. Maybe our contractors are not at the same level as us, so we need to raise their game a little bit, bring them along the journey so that they are undertaking some of the practices that we do as part of our management system. Or they may have to operate and run an element of our management system. Where they have their own management systems, we have to think about how we may have to interface our system with their system. And when we talk about that, it could be interface documents or bridging documents that show certain requirements and who takes responsibility in certain situations, for example, in an emergency situation. And there must be a development of continual management and improvement of the performance of our contractors and our supply chain. Where these are potential significant risks to our business, we must monitor and measure them. And of course, where we see potential weaknesses or areas identified, we must develop improvement programs. As mentioned before and touched on, emergency preparedness is absolutely a requirement as part of various international standards and, of course, legal requirements. So we have to think about emergency preparedness. And this should be the processes and procedures that are in place to ensure the organization is prepared for any form of natural or man-made disaster that could result in an emergency. So remember, this is about the preparedness of it. It's not about this is what we do in an emergency because we're in an emergency right now. This is how we prepare ourselves. So we're going to talk through how we go about doing this and how the preparedness works in terms of the communication, what people need to understand, what they need to do in the situation, the protocols and how we will test them, and what equipment or services we might have to rely on, and where other possible scenarios may have to be considered. So we have to have processes and procedures to identify potential for accidents and emergency situations, and appropriately how we will respond to them and minimize the risks from these emergency situations. And we must ensure that we have appropriate training to the people that are assigned with the responsibilities. And that depends on the level within the company. This can be anything from awareness to all of our employees, to maybe people who are coordinators of emergency response activities, having a little bit more detailed understanding of their requirements and training, through to maybe someone, particularly in larger, higher risk organizations, you might have an emergency response team and management activities within that. And therefore, the level of training required there is going to be far greater. It is important that we recognize this requirement is based on the risk in our business. We must be able to demonstrate how we test the emergency response, not just that we have it in place, but we're testing that we are ready. And when we have these tests, we must review them. We must look at how we were prepared, how we responded, what procedures we followed, what protocols, what equipment and facilities there were. And we must look at this in a way where we can try and drive improvement associated to it. We must also think about this in terms of crisis and business continuity, which to some organizations they would class also under the emergency bracket. So what processes and procedures do we need to be able to demonstrate how we would manage a crisis through potential business continuity management practices, and including also the communication internally and externally? So remember, when there is an emergency or a crisis and business continuity is impacted, this can have significant impact to other stakeholders, not just us as our operational activities. And we must ensure that we provide appropriate training again to ensure that assigned people that take on the role of crisis management or business continuity, and this level again of the type of training and responsibility is going to be based on the potential risk to our business. So we may have to test our crisis management or business continuity program. And again, we should be reviewing how we handle that, how well it has been achieved, and look for ways in which we can improve it after a test or after an incident. Now let's move on to phase 3, where we're going to talk a little bit about internal auditing of our system, management review of the implemented system. So, a completed management review system should be reviewed by top management on a regular basis. Management review is a terminology that's used as part of the international standards, and it should be recognized that it forms a set agenda. So management should decide the frequency of this review, and it's usually anything from monthly, quarterly to a minimum of once a year, where you review all the systems at a fairly high level. Remember, there will be ongoing monitoring and measurement analysis. Depending on the criticality, this could be an ongoing activity daily, or it could be something that's looked at regularly by a health and safety manager or a quality advisor or environmental consultant. Management reviews are not implementation status meetings. They are systems that they are meetings that look at the effectiveness of how things are going. So the review looks at data over time to see if the desired results, i.e. the objectives and plans and what we set out to achieve, are being achieved. And they should be demonstrating how action is taken if and when needed. So it must be based on factual data, must be based on information that's often presented at these meetings. Now, when we're in the implementation phase, management review would often come, and you might have a couple of these ahead of going through for certification. So you may have a management review on the early stage of implementation, and then a short period afterwards, just to see that you have captured and got the commitment from high-level management on areas that might need attention. A management review helps us make our system a little bit more dynamic, where we may have to change direction and put something in place. So if we don't do this, the system becomes a little bit static and ineffective if it's just the same thing all the time. We have to look at what is important to our organization based on our objectives and targets, based on the feedback that comes into this, and what we need to do to make changes to make us more dynamic and ideally drive improvement from our business. So a review of the implementation should be a significant part of that in the early days. So to be effective, management reviews should be well prepared. They should have agendas and data trends and information. And they allow top management to assess the effectiveness of the system based on the policy's objectives and, of course, the opportunities for improvement. They should allow top management to be presented with opportunities where changes need to occur, possibly based on the awareness and engagement with the workforce. And it's important that people that attend these meetings, they come prepared. They come prepared with the information to present. They have to understand, they know what the information means, and be prepared to respond to challenges and questions and provide recommendations to address where required. The output of management review should be in the form of specific actions, ensuring that improvements are made in the areas of products and services or processes and systems that are showing some weakness. And of course, they should also look at where there are identified resources may be needed. Management review outputs can also set the direction for the future. So they might look at new policies that might be considered. They might look at changing or improving our objectives that we've already established. They might look at specific initiatives that they want to agree on to drive forward and might start looking much further into the future. This very much depends upon how the company operates the management review process itself. If there's a lot of engagement, if it's done fairly regularly, say every quarter, let's say, then this can become quite a dynamic meeting. It is important to recognize that it doesn't have to necessarily be a standalone meeting. It could form part of a management meeting or directors meeting, but it's important that the right people are in attendance to be able to present the information and be able to take the measures and actions back to the workforce. The output of the meeting is in the form of a report, and often that report is used as evidence as part of your certification assessment and your ongoing surveillance of your management system. And it should be used to drive changes in the system where it's required for continual improvement. And it's quite good practice that maybe not the full report, but certain elements of it are shared with the workforce. Monitoring and measurement, of course, is a significant factor. And we already talked before about having to set these activities up in terms of what it is that's important to our business. These allow us to monitor our performance, our operational controls, and our conformity to legal requirements, significant risks and impacts, and our objectives and targets. Furthermore, they allow us to verify our monitoring and measurement equipment where it may be appropriate, associated to calibration, measurement, safety equipment and accessories. So various monitoring measurement activities have to be set as targets within our business of what we want to achieve. And of course, they must come with the appropriate roles and responsibilities. Evaluation of compliance is another significant element of our management system implementation. Have we implemented the appropriate compliance requirements associated to our legal standards and other requirements? And how do we evaluate that what we have implemented we're achieving? How can we show that we are in compliance? And often this can form part of an internal audit. And remember, Changes in compliance can be driven by often by external influences associated to legal changes, changes in international standards, and possibly changes imposed on us by contracts or areas of industry that we work in. And part of the evaluation of compliance forms part of our monitoring and measurement activities and our performance evaluation. Of course, any successful management system will always identify areas of non-conformity, because we're not all perfect, and areas where we can have weakness and drive improvement. So we have to have our systems in place to identify actual and potential non-conformities. And these may be from employee engagement, where they are raising awareness, where they are maybe using safety observation type systems or toolbox talks. They may be related to an accident or an incident that has occurred. They may be related to internal or external audits that are done, or part of our monitoring and measurement that's raised something. Key thing about this is that we should take action to stop and correct these non-conformities. Where they have a significant impact, we want to look to try and correct this as quickly as possible. So we may have to put containment measures in place. And then we have to understand how we go about mitigating so that we can identify the root cause and put the appropriate corrective actions in place. So there may be short-term measures we have to do that then need to be followed up with processes and procedures that monitor, investigate, and identify long-term corrective actions. So identify the actual and potential non-conformities, investigate them to determine what the root cause is, ensure that you have the appropriate people in the team to do that investigation, take corrective action to avoid reoccurrence. So obviously you need to identify what the appropriate corrective actions are. And we must consider how effective our actions have been. If it's not a long-term effective action, then we need to take additional appropriate measures, because the key thing is that we want to be effective at removing the likelihood of this non-conformity happening again. And remember, sharing of this information is very effective. It allows other people within our workforce to understand why we've made these changes. Also, it's good to share with other parts of our business, or maybe other parts of our industry, where we can provide best practice advice. There's a flow in which how we should undertake our corrective action process, and there are many other videos. We also have a training video here on YouTube about root cause corrective action, and methods of doing investigation that you may want to look at those for more detail. Controlling of our records of management system is important. So it's a key element that we are able to demonstrate the records of how we developed our system, how we implemented our system, the maintenance practices we undertake associated to our system, and of course where we've recognized other obligations outside of our business, maybe contractual, legal, or standards. Internal auditing is a significant area of identifying how successful you have been at implementing, and it is very good at identifying areas that you need to make changes to. So we want to establish and implement an internal audit program. We need to share with the workforce why we're doing this. And it will allow us to identify our conformity with our requirements and the requirements of the standard, but also identify areas where we maybe not quite met the requirements of implementation. So it looks at our effectiveness and our opportunities for improvement, and of course provides a formal way of reporting this to top management. In many organizations, it will be beneficial both from an administratively and for the purpose of expanding knowledge to integrate and combine various systems together. These may be related to environment, safety, quality, information security, whatever they may be. So the advantages of combining maybe have significant benefit in relation to administrative activity, but also in relation to how risks complement one another. But we must remember that the advantages of combining may be outweighed by other disadvantages. So this may result, for example, of over-complex systems and documentation, and may become actually a burden in some parts of our business. Very much depends upon the complexities of our business, the size and the risks. Many organizations believe that an integrated approach is the right way, but we must simply remember that in some cases, there might be elements that have to be standalone and cannot be integrated. We must establish continual review within our business, and how we go about doing that continual review should form part of our monitoring and measurement. And the continual review process often is the responsibility of various people within our business. It's not just about one person looking at that, but we must be looking at it from an operational, a service, a supply chain, a governance, financial, and so on and so forth. And when we think about continual improvement, it's important to recognize an old theory of simply plan, do, check, act. This is a cyclic approach that simply looks at what you are planning to do, how you've done it, how you've gone about checking how successful it was, and acting upon improving so that you plan to achieve better. So determine the scope of the system during your initial phase, which will continually develop throughout the life cycle of your implementation. What is it you're trying to plan to achieve and the timelines? And then under the doing part is to develop appropriate documentation, assign responsibilities, and really look to identify that you have the relevant activities in place for it to be effective. And on an ongoing basis, you want to check it. So periodically monitor and check to ensure the system is working in the areas that it's being implemented, and does it effectively meet the requirements of your business and the requirements of the standard. In these early stages of implementation, there will be weakness areas. So you want to act upon them. So take appropriate measures to rectify any of these weaknesses and shortfalls, and any updating where the circumstances may have changed or where there are areas of incidents or findings that need to have actions taken. So PDCA. Then getting into our final phase, which is the certification management phase, we have to apply to a certification body to achieve a certification assessment. We have to provide them, or they may come to review our documented system to look to see that we are ready. And this is associated to our stage 1, which is an evaluation of the readiness, where they've identified areas for improvement or they've seen some weaknesses. They will suggest that we take action and provide them with an action plan of what we've done. And if you've gone through a very good implementation process as described previously, then you will have this in place. Then they will go through a certification audit where they will look to see your management review and your implementation of any further improvements, what your planned corrective action responses to these non-conformities raised would be, and where you're successful at this, you will be granted your certification. And then there will be often follow-up annual surveillance audits. And these will be looking often at how you are driving improvement throughout your business. It's important that I mention again that there can be implementation barriers of any management system. And again, I'm going to stress This is just simply often because of change. And as humans, we often put up barriers to change. And the ways of driving those barriers down is spoken about before, and I'll touch on again. Some of the implementation barriers is lack of management support and commitment. If we don't get our management support and commitment, then that can have an impact on our staff. Okay, they don't see the support from management, and they don't see the commitment from management. Therefore, they don't see the necessary requirement for them to commit to it. So often there can be a lack of support from our workforce. We may have inadequate resources in order to achieve it. And we need to ensure that if these are barriers, we identify them early and raise them. We may have an inadequate awareness and culture within the organization around what we're trying to achieve. And we may have a lack of clear responsibilities and authorities, people happy to take those responsibilities. And we may have something that's just simply too complex for our organization. So we have to look at what we want to do to try and reduce that, try and minimize those barriers. And one of the big ways is the engagement process during implementation. As I said previously, if we continue that process from the beginning all the way through, then we will have a very good fundamental engagement process that will live on. So a management system takes time and commitment from the entire organization. Effective implementation and running of a management system will provide ongoing benefit, cost saving, and contributing to building an attractive workplace and culture. The process approach to management systems allows for an easier and simpler adoption often of doing this. It identifies clear roles and responsibilities associated to tasks that people should do. And of course, there's ways and means of using electronic systems now that allow us to make that even more simpler. But it is important that we recognize the commitment and the engagement of the full workforce, because having a fantastic management system will not bring any benefit to an organization unless they have the engagement of the workforce to be able to use it and operate it. So thanks very much for taking the time to listen to this video. And we'd like to again ask you to take the opportunity to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on LinkedIn. Thanks very much.